Hey everyone, this is a chapter from James Burnham and the Struggle for the World, A Life by Daniel Kelly. I'm not reading the entirety of this biography. I'm just reading the parts that are about Burnham's period with the as a leftist. This chapter is called Deviationist. Burnham's disagreement with Trotsky over the French turn concerned only a passing tactical problem, but as preparations for the new Trotskyist party moved forward, the two found themselves at odds over a more serious issue, and this time a doctrinal issue, the political nature of the USSR, or in Trotskyist parlance, quote, the Russian question. The issue was first raised by one of the movement's senior members, a 27-year-old New Yorker named Joseph Friedman, usually called by his party name alias, quote, Joe Carter, end quote, end parenthesis. Briefly a communist student leader at City College, Carter had been expelled from the party in 1928 for Trotskyist heresy. Finding his way to Canon, Carter had helped to launch the Communist League of America and now managed the movement's East 12th Street bookstore. A Bolshevik zealot, Joseph Carter devoutly read a few pages of Lenin every day, as a fervent Puritan might daily read his Bible, but he also read other socialist writers, among them the German theorist Rudolf Hilferding. It was probably under Hilferding's influence they decried, perhaps in 1936, that the USSR was no longer a worker state, or even, as Trotsky said, a, quote, degenerated worker state, but a state whose defining characteristics was, quote, bureaucratic collectivism. In the fall of 1937, Carter won Burnham to his theory. Quote, one day, I tried to relate Trotsky's and formulas to reality, end quote. Burnham later wrote, quote, on such scrutiny, it did not take long for the formulas to evaporate, end quote, end parenthesis. To call the USSR a, quote, workers' state, in the traditional sense given to the term by Marxism, end quote, was no longer possible, the two argued in November 1937 issue of the movement debate sheet, The Internal Bulletin. But rather, the USSR had become the property of its bureaucracy and other elites. But Carter and Burnham did not reject orthodoxy completely. Since the Soviet state had taken the genuinely socialist step of expropriating the capitalists, they conceded workers still had a duty to defend it. One second. Sorry, I gotta see if there's. I gotta try to find these end notes. Is it at the end of chapter or at the end of the book? Oh shit, it's at the end of the book. Sorry, I know this is irritating. What chapter is this again? Chapter 4. All right, I got there. Footnote. James Burnham and Joseph Carter Amendment to Majority Resolution, Internal Bulletin, hereafter IB. Okay. Back to the text. End footnote. From his Mexican stronghold, Trotsky promptly riposted. The USSR was indeed a genuine workers' state despite the decay that had set in under Stalin. Trotsky insisted in the Internal Bulletin's next issue. A nationalized economy and central planning sufficed to make it so. Carter and Burnham had gone astray in their analysis because they failed to take, quote, an objective dialectical approach to the question, end quote. But the two dissenters would not yield. In a rejoinder to Trotsky called, quote, From Formula to Reality, which is on this channel, Burnham proceeding on empirical grounds, maintained that the Soviet regime could best be understood as a tool of the, quote, privileged strata of Soviet society, end quote. The bureaucracy, the intellectuals, the GPU, and the Red Army, among others, which should be viewed as a new bourgeoisie seeking to consolidate its power. Hence, the claim that workers had a duty to defend the USSR, though justified by the surviving, quote, progressive features of Soviet life, had to be qualified. It would hold good if the USSR were attacked by imperialist powers, but not if the USSR were the aggressor. Moreover, he reminded his readers, Bolshevism aimed at far more than a nationalized economy. Nationalization was merely a means of attacking the higher end of a free and egalitarian society. If Trotsky as confusing means and ends lost sight of this truth, the movement would lose its rationale, and Stalinism, which had already completed the work of nationalization, would be the, quote, better choice, end quote. Footnote. See James Burnham, From Formula to Reality. Carter couched his answer to Trotsky in similar terms, but more than Burnham fixed his attention on the Soviet Economic Directorate. The stratum, quote, managers of trust, foremen in factories, highly skilled technicians, etc., end quote, had evolved into a new class, he contended, whose interests and ambitions were merging with those of the bureaucrats. Managerial power now defined the Soviet state. Footnote. See Joseph Carter, The Class Nature of the Stalinist State, which I believe I have recorded and should be on this channel soon. Trotsky reiterated that revolutionaries had a duty to defend the USSR, an unconditional duty. Shit. Accidentally closed out of the PDF. But if Trotsky's stance was adamant, Trotsky's tone was mild, perhaps partly because the dissenters, despite the reservations, still endorsed, quote, defensism, partly because the issue was only theoretical, and partly because he did not want a split in the movement just as his new party was being formed. After his second response, he suspended the debate, assigning its settlement to the party's founding convention. The skirmish over the Russian question led Burnham to raise a second issue in late 1937, the, quote, organization question, or problem of dictatorial leadership in the movement. Among those to whom he complained was his student Norman Jacobs, a former Mustite who suspecting Trotskyism of totalitarian leanings, had dropped out of the American Workers' Party when it merged with the Communist League of America. Is Norman Jacobs anybody? Yeah, not seeing anything. Yeah, back to the text. Quote, my background permitted, bracket Burnham, and bracket, to sound off freely in discussions during, quote, tutorial sessions, bracket tutorial sessions, end bracket, ostensibly devoted to Aquinas, end quote. Norman Jacobs remembered, quote, I used to wonder how he could still remain a leader of one of the principal factions of the American Trotskyite movement and be agreeing with my criticisms, end quote. James Burnham had raised the issue with Cannon and Shachtman. He had a hunch, he told them, that if they ever came to head an American Soviet government, they would be, quote, just as ruthless as Stalin, end quote. The resolution on party organization that Cannon and Shachtman drafted for the founding convention increased Burnham's uneasiness, based on the Leninist principle of, quote, democratic centralism, end quote. It put its stress on, quote, centralism and the need for strong leadership and discipline, warning that the party could not operate like a, quote, discussion club, end quote. Seeing an omen of dictatorial rule, Burnham, again working with Carter, drafted a counter-resolution shifting the stress from, quote, centralism to, quote, democratic, and calling for the distribution of party functions among, quote, a far greater number of members than had been the case in the past, end quote. The party should also be open to a wide range of opinions, the two added, including the Carter-Burnham view of the USSR. Burnham also took his worries directly to Trotsky. In the past, he wrote, the old man, Trotskyists, had never made opinion a condition of party membership, but had welcomed all comers willingly to do party work and accept party discipline. Now, however, Cannon seemed to want to impose a narrow doctrinal conformity and to expel people for purely intellectual reasons. He himself opposed intellectual straitjackets. He did not demand that a party mirror, quote, actually and in every respect, end quote, his own views, but choose the party whose ideas came closest to its own, and that was, quote, genuinely serious, end quote, about its goals, and he expected that, quote, in the course of our common work, bracket, the members would, end bracket, mutually influence each other, end quote. In his reply, Trotsky sought to allay Burnham's anxiety. Party rules would be, quote, elaborated, corrected, and improved, end quote, over the years, Trotsky promised. Trotsky's own main concern was the Russian question, since disagreement on that issue could in the near future push the party into, quote, total breakdown. Trotsky, who wished to keep Burnham in the movement and thought that a meeting between them might help. Trotsky also wished to keep Burnham in the movement and thought that a meeting between them might help. Trotsky had been delighted to learn of Burnham's adhesion to the Fourth International. Trotsky added in his letter on the organization question, quote, I follow with the greatest possible interest your writings in the party press, and I should like very much to meet you sometime personally. Don't you believe it would be possible? End quote. Trotsky. Burnham's answer has disappeared, but Burnham and Trotsky were never to meet. Trotsky, however, need not have worried about losing Trotsky's prize recruit, for Burnham was far too committed to the movement to think about leaving. Indeed, at Cannon's request, and despite his own awareness that an official party credo might encourage the very dogmatism he feared, he even agreed to draw up a, quote, declaration of principles for the founding convention. On the 31st of December 1937, delegates from Trotskyist and left-wing socialist groups around the country convened in Chicago to launch the new party. The Socialist Workers' Party, American section of the Fourth International. Though the delegates approved the Declaration of Principles Burnham had drafted, they roundly defeated the Carter-Burnham resolution on the Russian question, 89-40. Burnham and Carter then loyally accepted a majority resolution affirming Trotsky's position, including, quote, unconditional defense of the USSR. Those who would not submit were at once ejected. At Cannon's behest, Burnham officially proclaimed the expulsion of these diehards. In addition, Burnham agreed to serve with Cannon and Shachtman in the Socialist Workers' Party three-man National Secretariat and to sit at the Socialist Workers' Party's political committee, or Polkom, the equivalent of the Soviet Communist Politburo, which acted as the party's day-to-day ruling body. Moreover, as the new International prepared to resume publication, he returned to his old post of co-editor. He had not only proved his allegiance to the Socialist Workers' Party, he had also emerged as one of its supreme commanders. New section. In outward form, a political party, in inner substance, the Socialist Workers' Party was much like a religious sect. At the center of the party stood the cult figure of the old man, with his distinctive goatee and great shock of unruly hair. To his followers, Trotsky seemed a hero martyr who would help Lenin to lead a world-saving revolution, and they'd be robbed of his rightful place as Lenin's heir by the usurping Stalin and forced to eat the bitter bread of exile. Yet not all was lost. Trotsky's followers believed, for the tragic victim still possessed his sacred knowledge, the gnosis of the Marxist dialectic, through which, one day, the evil Stalin would be laid low and mankind redeemed. But both an intellectual, political theorist and strategist, master polemicist, writer on literature and culture, historian, and a man of action, chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, architected the Bolshevik Revolution, created the Red Army, Trotsky radiated charisma for his disciples. These disciples, an ardent band of zealots, put the Trotskyist faith at the center of their lives. Many lived entirely for and through the movement. To the New Yorkers among them, Socialist Workers' Party headquarters, now on University Place near Washington Square College, marked the epicenter of a cosmos whose center was Trotsky's Mexican villa. Steeled against the surrounding fallen world, the party provided its members with a total community, furnishing not only a cause that gave meaning to existence, but also a social life and even their spouses. In a story called The Renegade, about a fictional party closely modeled on the Socialist Workers' Party, novelist James T. Farrell described the New York Trotskyist milieu, quote, "The life and activity of the party was largely internal. Party members saw one another constantly, and when they were together, they talked and bragged about the party and party life," end quote. The party's leader, a self-important windbag named Patrick A. Nolan, proclaims, quote, "Bolshevik hardness," end quote, to be the party's motto and signal virtue. The typical party member sees himself, quote, as one of a small and almost unknown band that was scorned and opposed on all sides, but which would nonetheless someday change the entire history of the world, end quote. Quote, "Our leaders," declares one, quote, "are the advance guard of humanity," end quote. Another says, quote, "Stalin is more afraid of us than of any other force in the world," end quote. Let's look that up real quick. James T. Farrell is an American novelist, short story writer, and poet. James T. Farrell is most remembered for the Studs Lonergan trilogy, which was made into a film in 1960 and a television series in 1979. Back to the text. When not busy trying to spread their gospel, organizing protest rallies, executing, quote, turns and other tactical operations against leftist rivals, savaging Stalinists and liberals, publishing the New International and the Socialist Appeal, and otherwise toiling for the cause, the Trotskyist faithful came together to relax. At, quote, socials, they danced, gossiped, argued, flirted, and gathered around an upright piano to sing labor songs. Socials often featured Cannon pursuing a favorite pastime, entertaining the comrades by giving a poetry recital. To raise money, the Socialist Workers' Party sometimes held more elaborate festivities. One event, a 1938, quote, harvest masquerade, boasted a, quote, swing band, competitions, entertainment, prizes for the best costumes, end quote, and a, quote, master of ceremonies, end quote. The irrepressible, and as, quote, master of ceremonies, end quote, the irrepressible Shachtman. Another had at its high point a, quote, modern dance performed by Mary McCarthy, then debuting as a drama critic, and the writer Eleanor Clark. Decades later, one former Socialist Workers' Party member finally remembered that the, quote, delectable Mary McCarthy had sat on his lap. Mary McCarthy is just a famous novelist and political activist. New section. Burnham, however, rarely took part in Trotskyist high life. What Burnham sought in the Socialist Workers' Party was not a, quote, what Burnham sought in the Socialist Workers' Party was not an all-embracing community, but an instrument to revolutionize society. Aside from a few exceptional instances, an appearance at a fundraiser, for example, or dinner with the Shachtmans, Burnham's social life remained entirely outside the movement. Burnham's friends found his Trotskyism mystifying. Quote, of all people, end quote, was the common reaction. Burnham's Princeton friend Curtin Winsor beseeched him to give up the Socialist Workers' Party. Lucius Wilmerding stopped talking with him about politics. Sorry, I'm looking some of these people up. Sidney Schiff was also bewildered and asked David Burnham whether he could explain his brother's odd behavior. Still, despite his perplexing Trotskyism, Burnham remained in many ways the man he had always been, earnest, a firm empiricist, at least in intent, for like other Marxists, he tended to argue as much from ideological premises as from observation, his position on the Russian question notwithstanding, and a tireless worker. And now as before, he edited a highbrow journal, albeit one devoted to politics rather than culture, nor the tone of his writings changed. If less academic than his literary criticism for the Symposium, his political articles for the New International breathed the same total self-assurance. He also still paid close attention to practical matters, insisting on the importance of careful organization, for example, which he considered indispensable to the effective diffusion of ideas. Finally, the Augustinian streak in his temperament, the sense that the world was shot through with evil and sadness, and that much that was wrong could be traced to human nature, shaded his view of life as much as ever. One reflection of this was his dislike of political optimists, the reformist left, liberals, progressives, who, Burnham believed, lacked the stomach to face up to reality, and so took refuge in consoling myths about the world and man. This aspect of Burnham's personality is perhaps what led Hooke to describe him as, quote, inwardly quite hard, end quote, Burnham's aversion to, quote, sentimentalists, end quote, rang out in the scathing tone in which he wrote about them, thus reviewing the political scientist Louis Hacker's My America, 1928 to 1938, a liberal reformist meditation on the 1930s, Burnham did not simply criticize Hacker's ideas, but assaulted the book as an expression of, quote, muddled, wishy-washy, and indeed Philistine democratism, end quote. I'm not sure. I think this is the right person. Lewis M. Hacker lived from 1899 to 1987, was an American economic historian, professor of economics at Columbia University, and founding dean of its School of General Studies and author. He is known as a leading proponent of adult education. Back to the text. Nor did Burnham have any use for middle-of-the-roaders, quote, of all the forms of politics, end quote. Burnham wrote elsewhere, quote, centrism is the lowest. Centrism in politics is the equivalent of hypocrisy in personal morality, end quote. Burnham. This, quote, realism and, quote, tough-mindedness played no small part in his gravitation to Trotskyism, for the movement loved to picture itself as hard-boiled. But if realism and tough-mindedness helped to convert him to Trotskyism, his critical bent and need for autonomy acted as counterweights, keeping him from ever embracing the movement completely. An equally powerful counterweight was Marcia Burnham, who gave Trotskyism as wide a berth as possible. Though she had dinner now and then with the Shachtmans and drinks at least once with the movement journalist Dwight MacDonald and his wife, Nancy, nothing short of a gun to her head could have persuaded her to spend an evening listening to Cannon recite poetry. Oscar Schoenfeld had a clearer impression of the almost invisible Mrs. Burnham than most party members, but only because he had once caught a fleeting glimpse of her, a tall, slim blonde in a silk dress, he recalled, as he passed by the door of Burnham's NYU office. By affording her husband a life apart from Trotskyism, Marcia weakened the magnetic pull of the Socialist Workers' Party. So, too, did Burnham's classes at NYU, which drew him away from politics into philosophy. Yet the siren call of the movement never abated. When the Socialist Workers' Party was on the point of being launched, Cannon again pressed him to work full-time for the party. Other comrades echoed the leader. At the Socialist Workers' Party's founding convention, one delegate, an old trucker, said to him during a break in the debate on the Russian question, quote, now, Jimmy, just come in with us full-time and we'll vote for any resolutions you want to write, end quote. As before, Burnham held out against the pressure, yet his resistance troubled him, and in January 1938 he asked Cannon and Shachtman to discuss his problem with him. According to Cannon, when the three met, Burnham agreed that Cannon might be right in tracing the differences between them to the contradictions between Burnham's and personal life and his responsibilities as a revolutionary leader, end quote. But he was not yet ready to resolve these contradictions, he said. Could he be temporarily released from party duties to have time to ponder the matter? Cannon Shachtman acceded, hoping, as Cannon wrote Trotsky, to, quote, save Burnham for the revolution, end quote. But Burnham continued to hold back, quote, try as we would, end quote, Shachtman remembered, quote, directly by indirection, by pressure, by suggestion, by cajolery, by every device we could think of, we could never induce him to come to work in the party office, ... It was obvious, and as I became increasingly more intimate with him, increasingly obvious that he was torn. There were clearly times when he was on the verge of throwing it all up, namely his job at the university, and perhaps other personal involvements in coming to work for the party, and that he felt this urge very strongly and very sincerely, end quote. But in the end, Burnham stayed put. To his comrades, this probably came as no surprise. Quote, all of us, and this went for Cannon and myself in particular, felt that although Burnham was with us and with us thoroughly, Burnham was not, so to say, of us, end quote. Shachtman later commented. quote, bracket, Burnham, end bracket, does not really feel himself to be one of us, end quote. Cannon told Trotsky, quote, party work for Burnham is not a vocation, but an avocation, end quote. Shachtman yielded with good grace to Burnham's decision, but Cannon, already exacerbated by Burnham's ideological deviations, seems to have felt a deepening hostility toward him. Cannon and Shachtman blamed Burnham's behavior on his, quote, bourgeois background. Quote, his social environment is entirely different, end quote, Cannon observed. To Shachtman, Burnham's very presence in the Socialist Workers' Party seemed, quote, accidental. And indeed, Burnham resembled no one's idea of a Trotskyist. Polite, reserved, conservatively dressed, he projected the image not of a Bolshevik revolutionary, but of a partner in a Wall Street firm. Quote, he wore $100 suits, end quote, noted a fascinated Harry Roskolenko. Quote, he went to the theater too, end quote. At the time of the AWP, American Workers' Party, Communist League of America merger, William Randolph Hearst, New York American, had accused Hook and Burnham of leading a party, quote, even more radical than the communists, end quote, and demanded that NYU fire them. But the university would not do so, partly, thought Hook, because the administration simply could not see in Burnham, to all appearances, quote, a pillar of the right-thinking establishment, end quote, a menace to the social order. Burnham's private life dramatized his distance from the movement. Trotsky has tended towards a hand-to-mouth existence. In late 1934, the Burnhams moved from village to firmly hot bourgeois Sutton Place. One evening, Shachtman appeared at Burnham's door with some new international galley shots needing reviewing, only to find Burnham in formal dress. Burnham was the only Trotskyist to own a tuxedo, Schoenfeld felt sure. Hosting a dinner party. Leaving the table, Burnham took his fellow Bolshevik to another room, where they gave the galley sheets that required going over, after which Shachtman sped off, and Burnham, a task on behalf of the world revolution completed, returned to his guests. On another occasion, Trotsky's secretary, a Frenchman named Jean van Heijenoort, was visiting New York and received a dinner invitation from the Burnhams. Arriving at their apartment, he was surprised to find awaiting him an elegantly set candlelit table. The sight would not have given pause to a Stalinist. In the 1930s, well-off people sometimes found Stalinism chic. Parenthesis, quote, the revolutionary barricades become everybody's jungle gym, end quote. The critic Diana Trilling once said of the 30s. Wikipedia says Diana Trilling lived from 1905 to 1996, was an American literary critic and author, and one of a group of left-wing writers known as the New York Intellectuals. But in the down at the heels world, back to the text, but in the down at the heels world of American Trotskyism, the Burnham household was unique. If Burnham's fellow Trotskyists, like his college friends, were puzzled by his presence in the movement, many were glad to have him with them. For one thing, his character earned him their approval. He quickly acquired a reputation for, quote, impartiality and, quote, fairness. Shachtman remembered, while Albert Glotzer recalled that party members found him, quote, honest and straightforward, end quote. For another, the comrades were struck by his intelligence and skill at debate. For still another, he was, as one of them put it, quote, fresh, having come to the left in his late 20s rather than as they had in his teens, or even earlier. He was free of the conventional Marxist mindset and party cliches. Moreover, he usually wrote about the American rather than the Soviet scene, thus bringing needed breadth to the Trotskyist focus. To Schoenfeld, he seemed the very model of the radical intellectual, that he had none of the left's tub-thumping style, and was, quote, in touch with America, end quote, only heightened his appeal in Schoenfeld's eyes. Farrell, too, noted Burnham's familiarity with the American scene, calling Burnham the one Socialist Workers' Party member who, quote, made consistently good analyses of American political events, American business in relation to what is happening here, and what is going on in the major political parties, etc., end quote. The comrades also agreed that Burnham had no great knack for public speaking. Still, he was now a reasonably competent orator. His speeches might be short on, quote, razzle-dazzle, recalled Shachtman's wife Yetta, but they were long on content. Moreover, by the late 1930s, he had shed the didactic tone that had alienated his earlier audience, and so no longer faced the hostility he had once provoked. His restrained and concise podium style could also work against him. Thus, during one intra-party debate, he spoke for a mere 2 hours. Thus, during one intra-party debate, prompting some of those present used to endless tirades on such occasions to doubt his seriousness. But such doubts were rare. Quote, his participation in the party may have been part-time, but his interest in the party was full-time, end quote. Shachtman once commented, and because the great value of his contribution was universally recognized, quote, no one ever dreamed of questioning the appropriateness of his position as a party leader, end quote. Yet if the comrades admired Burnham, his reserved superior social status and full life outside of the movement made some of them uneasy. Irving Howe thought him, quote, haughty in manner and speech, ... logical, gifted, terribly dry, end quote. Manny Geltman, a Trotskyist of the first hour, called him, quote, not cool, bracket, but, and bracket, cold, exclamation point, end quote. Burnham's ability to, quote, sit through an endless faction fight on the hottest day or night in a room with little air and never open his shirt collar or loosen his tie, end quote, caused Geltman to marvel. Yet a Shachtman who described Burnham as, quote, impressive, found Burnham's reserve intimidating. Quote, not that he was snobbish, end quote. She said, quote, but you didn't just go up to him, end quote. Glotzer, another Burnham admirer, echoed Mrs. Shachtman. Burnham wasn't cold, end quote, Glotzer told an interviewer, but he, quote, held himself in such a way that people didn't come up and slap his back, end quote. The writer James T. Farrell saw Burnham in a different light. Quote, Burnham is a nice guy, but prissy and ministerial, and Burnham's face looks it, end quote. Farrell noted in his diary, quote, he is doing penance for his symposium past, and tends to over-politicize everything, end quote. Burnham served as the basis for a character in Farrell's novel, Sam Holman, set in the radical New York of the 1930s. The description for this book says, a candid look at left-wing New York Jewish intellectuals in the 1930s. The book centers around the Menorah Journal, an American Jewish Committee-backed magazine that preceded commentary. Back to the text. Typically, when NYU philosophy professor and militant Trotskyist, quote, Bertram Jackson, end quote, a, quote, tall, brown-haired fellow about 30, end quote, with, quote, a soft, almost mushy face, end quote, goes to a party, he heads for a corner and spends the evening debating Hegel's logic. Burnham was saddened that he made some comrades uneasy. To become more approachable, he tried to make his bearing less forbidding. Sometimes he attempted a matey manner, dropping his polite, quote, bourgeois mode of speech in favor of what he seems to have viewed as proletarian earthiness, but seldom successful, for his deep-seated sense of propriety would trip him up, quote, when Jim says, quote, fucking, he blushes, end quote. Shachtman chuckled. With Cannon, to whom he had early taken a dislike, parenthesis, he described the Trotskyist leader to Hook in 1935 as, quote, lazy, arrogant, impatient, and a drunkard, end quote, end parenthesis. Burnham's relations were often strained. During the Socialist Workers' Party debate, the two almost came to blows when Burnham, opposing Cannon on the point at issue, remarked, quote, everyone knows James likes to drink, end quote. As Cannon balled his fist and seemed about to charge, Burnham added, quote, milk, end quote. But between Burnham and Shachtman, a friendship developed. The only personal relationship Burnham ever formed in the Socialist Workers' Party. It was Burnham who gave Shachtman his first lesson in modern art. At Burnham's apartment one day, seeing a painting that Yetta Shachtman thinks may have been a Mondrian, Shachtman was surprised that the painting was considered special. Quote, "I could have done that myself," end quote, he protested. Whereupon Burnham, assuming his role of professor of aesthetics, pointed out the qualities that made the work important. Quote, "What I would like to do is to separate Shachtman from Cannon," end quote. Burnham confided to Hooke, quote, "Shachtman, in spite of obvious deficiencies, seems to me the only one of the old CLA who has creative political ideas," end quote. New section. All the while, Burnham continued to work hard for the movement. In the Socialist Appeal, for which he resumed his labor action column, quote, "Their government," end quote, and the New International, he fired salvo after salvo at the New Deal, portraying New Deal as a proto-fascist plot to save a moribund capitalism from extinction. But he now focused his attention on what he alleged to be Roosevelt's drive toward war, which he accused the president of, quote, "deliberately and consciously," end quote, seeking as the ultimate means of forestalling a capitalist collapse. The New Deal, Burnham wrote, had become, quote, "the war deal," end quote. Its domestic goal was, quote, "a totalitarian military dictatorship," end quote, that would last as long as American, quote, "imperialism" continued. Abetted by his liberal and communist allies, Stalin, a, quote, "social imperialist," end quote, was backing American war plans in hopes of achieving a U.S.-Soviet alliance, end parenthesis. Roosevelt was trying to persuade the workers that the main enemy was Hitler, when in fact it was, quote, "the boss at home and the boss's government," end quote. Naturally, the U.S. imperialists, led by the, quote, 60 families, end quote, the high command of the plutocracy that ruled the United States, were trying to conceal their war plans behind slogans about making the world safe for democracy. But their true aim was, quote, "to make the world safe for profits," end quote. There was only one way to keep America out of war, Burnham argued. This was neither collective security, which was really just a ploy to guard the loot Britain and France had bagged in World War I, nor isolationism, which had to fail because of the 60 families that forced the United States into war. Nor could anything be expected of liberal pacifists who were simply diverting anti-war sentiment from the true causes of war, capitalism and imperialism, into channels harmless to the warmongers. No, the only way to stop wars was to overthrow the imperialists who started them. Burnham also lectured on behalf of the movement. In the fall of 1938, Burnham, Shachtman, and Cannon taught a course at the Socialist Workers' Party's Marxist school called The Bridge to Revolutionary Action, which met Tuesdays from 8:45 to 10:15 p.m. at party headquarters. The following spring, the Marxist school offered another course, Problems of American Politics, with Burnham again teaching. In the fall of 1939, Burnham returned to the Marxist school's podium, now in tandem with Dwight MacDonald, for a 6-lecture series entitled The War Deal in Action. Burnham pitched in further by serving the movement as a strategist, though not acknowledging that the party's primary business was world revolution. He thought it crucial that Trotskyists also be involved in more modest undertakings, and so willingly took up tactical issues of the most limited scope. Thus, in 1939, he wrote at some length to a Socialist Workers' Party leader in Chicago on an upcoming municipal election, quote, "Isn't it possible for us to run some kind of candidate on the ballot in the Chicago election?" end quote, he asked, unhappy with a plan to mount a write-in candidacy. Quote, "Couldn't the Chicago organization pick an office and a district of the city where it could be possible for us to do whatever you have to do to get a Socialist Workers' Party name and label on the ballot? ... Experience shows that a write-in campaign doesn't mean a damn." Meanwhile, Burnham still had to meet a heavy teaching schedule at NYU, including all the extra chores teaching requires. Not surprisingly, he continued to come down often with minor illnesses. Quote, another session of sinus and heavy cold infection left me enough energy to get through to the end of the summer school, end quote. He reported to Hook. Quote, and the doctor has ordered me to be sure to get into good general condition if I don't want to be in bad shape all next winter, end quote. One moment. Okay. New section. When Burnham shut down the symposium and took up politics, Burnham did not stop writing literary criticism. Nor did Burnham give up his earlier critical standards for Bolshevik standards, which viewed art through the prism of politics, replacing aesthetic criteria of judgment with political criteria. Hence he treated the crudely politicized fiction of the 1930s with severity. Quote, for the novel, ... as in the case of all art, classes of any sort are abstractions, end quote. But, quote, art is above all concrete, end quote. He warned. Quote, proletarian authors, in review of Albert Halper's novel, The Foundry, a typical specimen of 1930s, quote, socially conscious fiction. Quote, if proletarian novelists want to learn how to make classes and make struggle the subject matter of their novels, let them not go to the New Masses and the John Reed Club, quote, bracket, a communist-sponsored writers' organization, end bracket, magazines with the Balzac and James and Proust, end quote. The best revolutionary novels that he knew he wrote in 1935 were Ignazio Sillone's Fontamara and André Malraux's Man's Fate. Both of which presented a, quote, revolutionary of the world and have been so integrally focused into the structure of the novels that the primitive antagonism and oppositions, propaganda versus art, class versus individuals, and so on, do not raise problems. Wikipedia says, Fontamara was a 1933 novel written by the Italian author Ignazio Sillone, written when he was a refugee from fascist Italy and Switzerland. Fontamara is Sillone's first novel and is regarded as Fontamara's most famous work. As Sillone's most famous work. Fontamara received worldwide acclaim and sold more than 1.5 million copies in 27 languages. Fontamara was first published in German translation in Switzerland in 1933. English translation was published by Penguin Books in September 1934. In 1980, it was adapted by Carlo Lizzani into an eponymous film. Appearing on the eve of the Civil War and published just a few months after Adolf Hitler came to power, when the world was beginning to take sides for or against fascism, the novel had a galvanizing effect on public opinion. Fontamara became the, quote, very symbol of resistance, end quote, and is, quote, widely agreed to have played a major role as a document of anti-fascist propaganda outside Italy in the late 1930s, end quote, as it criticizes the immorality and deceit of the fascist party and its followers. Fontamara is a fictional village in Marsica in the Abruzzo region. Its name is derived from the Italian Fonte Amara, bitter stream. The people, the Fontamaresi, are poor, and the village is so remote that they are unaware of major social upheavals such as the rise of fascism. There is a tremendous gap between the Cafoni, peasants who populate Fontamara, and those who live in the city. The Fontamaresi work the earth to survive, turn to immigration as a means of economic improvement, and are isolated. ignorant of events happening outside of the region, and untouched by modernity and new technology. The impresario, in stark contrast to the Fontamaresi, who have labored for centuries to little avail, also quickly became the richest man in the region and embodied the power, authority, and immorality of the fascists. The Fontamaresi are exploited due to their naivety and ignorance. The women are raped by the black shirts. Barado Viola makes the ultimate sacrifice to allow the continued distribution of clandestine texts that spread the word about socialism and encourage rebellion against fascism. And at the end of the majority of the party are killed at the hands of the government. As with many rural novels, Fontamara discusses the various seasons and seasonal duties, such as the grape harvest in the vineyards. It is a choral novel that focuses on the lives and points of view of the peasants of Fontamara, deprived of hope yet persistent and determined. It depicts solidarity amongst the peasants and the inequality of wealth between the agricultural workers and the professional classes in the city. Back to the text, and the other one, André Malraux, Man's Fate. André Malraux, I'm not sure. Man's Fate is a 1933 novel by André Malraux about the failed communist insurrection in Shanghai in 1927 and the existential quandaries facing a diverse group of people associated with the revolution. Along with The Conquerors, published in 1928, and The Royal Way, published in 1930, Man's Fate forms a trilogy on revolution in Asia. Man's Fate was translated into English twice, both translations appearing in 1934, one by Hakon Chevalier, and the other, Man's Fate, published by Harrison Smith and Robert Haas in New York, and republished by Random House as part of their modern library from 1936 on, and the other by Alistair MacDonald under the title Storm in Shanghai, published by Methuen in London, and republished still by Methuen in 1948 as Man's Estate, to become a Penguin Pocket in 1961. Currently, the Chevalier translation is the only one still in regular print. In 1958, Hannah Arendt published The Human Condition, one of her central theoretical works, whose English name is identical to the French title of Malraux' book. To avoid confusion, Arendt's book was translated in French, first as Condition de l'homme moderne, the condition of modern man, then as La humaine condition. Back to the text. Thank you for allowing me that detour. I was curious about those books. Novelists must learn that, quote, social significance, end quote, is not a decoration to be purchased from a political warehouse and tacked on to a novel, end quote. He asserted in a new international review of Hemingway's To Have or Have Not and Have Not. Quote, it must, as Man's Fate, or When the Looms Are Silent, or Fontamara teach, parenthesis, or, for that matter, all great novels, in parenthesis, be simply the organic relevance of the novel both internally and to its own time, end quote. Burnham. Burnham found Ceylon, parenthesis, an Italian communist who had broken with the Communist Party at the turn of the 30s, especially appealing, calling his Bread and Wine, quote, an admirable and moving novel, end quote. A major source of present-day literary mediocrity, Burnham charged, was Stalinism, which condemns its adherents to, quote, the stultification of intelligence and sensibility, end quote. Stalin himself wrote in a, quote, indescribably tedious style, end quote, which was perhaps not the least among Stalin's sins, end quote. In a review of James T. Farrell's A Note on Literary Criticism for the Socialist Party's American Socialist Monthly, he congratulated Farrell for rejecting the Soviet dogma that literature must serve politics, declaring that it was not, quote, the business of a, quote, party line to dictate plot and sentence structure, end quote. Parenthesis, all the same, he himself, according to Farrell, later called Farrell's book incomplete for failing to show how the literary faults of communism stem from the Stalinist policy of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote. End parenthesis. In 1938, Burnham found a new vehicle for his criticism, a magazine called Partisan Review. The journal, which first came out in 1934, was the brainchild of two young Marxist critics, Philip Robb and William Phillips, who had persuaded Joseph Freeman, editor of the Communist Party literary journal New Masses, that the party needed a more genuine literary magazine. Agreeing, Freeman had given the two money to publish Partisan Review, for which the communist-run John Reed Club served as a sponsor. But before long, the party had begun to treat Partisan Review as it did the New Masses, ordering it to subordinate literary standards to political needs. Robb and Phillips had rebelled against the party dictate, and in 1936 Partisan Review had folded. But the next year its editors found new money, and Partisan Review was reborn, this time as, quote, a Marxist literary monthly, end quote, favoring modernism in the arts and the anti-Stalinist left in politics. The Trotskyists at once took a lively interest in the new Partisan Review as a potential asset for the movement in view of certain communist enmity. Burnham proposed to Robb and Phillips that they commit the magazine to Trotskyism in return for his cooperation. Robb and Phillips refused, but Robb and Phillips did give Burnham a seat on Partisan Review's editorial advisory board. Burnham also sent information on Partisan Review contributors to Trotsky, who followed the magazine's fortunes with an eagle eye. Mary McCarthy, Partisan Review's drama critic, Burnham described as, quote, a handsome, black-haired Irish girl of some wit and shrewdness, end quote, apparently a kind of literary career woman. A literary, quote, career woman, end quote, who sees anti-Stalinist left intellectualism as a good current racket, end quote, and Partisan Review as a handy, quote, stepping stone, end quote. His Socialist Workers' Party comrade, Dwight MacDonald, who had enlisted as one of the magazine's editors, summed up as, quote, a most delightful and dynamic and rather hair-brained person, end quote. But MacDonald was, quote, not a consistent political thinker, end quote, he warned. Quote, and I don't think he ever will be, end quote. Trotsky found these reports encouraging enough to ask Partisan Review to publish an essay of his on the ties between the natural and social sciences. Nothing came of Trotsky's request, but the magazine did eventually run another Trotsky piece, Art and Politics. But more important to Burnham than Partisan Review was the New International. Burnham wanted this journal to, quote, become the real center for intellectual life in the country, end quote, he told Hook. He hoped to make people think that, quote, they must buy it if they want to know what is going on, end quote, and so was, quote, very anxious, end quote, to publish, quote, discussion articles outside of and even against, quote, Trotskyism, end quote, end quote. This aim, however, led his thoughts back to Partisan Review. Putting the New International at the center of the country's intellectual life would be easier, he calculated, if the two magazines could merge, a step that would yield a, quote, large and fully rounded monthly, end quote, and just possibly, quote, a weekly, end quote. But he never pursued a merger, perhaps doubting that Robb and Phillips, who resisted being classified as Trotskyists, would ever agree to one. Instead, while toiling to bring luster to the New International, he also began writing criticism for Partisan Review, adhering to his usual exigent standards. One author who suffered his stern appraisal, the literary critic William Troy, complained to Farrell that, quote, Burnham was too logical about criticism, end quote. Yeah, I'm not just finding anything that I know is definitely related to this William Troy, but thank you for letting me engage in that. I was saying thank you as if the video was over, but it's not over.
New section. Though a fervent Trotskyist, Burnham nevertheless persisted in his ideological straying. Irritated from conventional readings of Marx, in 1938 he proposed to Hooke that they co-author a, quote, short, snappy book to be called, quote, Toward the Revision of Karl Marx, end quote, end quote. If only to refute the widely held, but now to his mind mistaken idea that dialectical logic was basic to Marx's thought. Since untestable, dialectics had to be meaningless, he wrote in Partisan Review. Parenthesis, though years before he himself had signaled dialectical thinking as the key to Lenin's success in 1917, and Trotsky's brilliance as a historian, in parenthesis. Its true importance lay in its function as a metaphor. Anti-Marxists attacked it as a way of attacking Marxist politics, while Marxists defended it as a symbol of the revolutionary cause. But dialectical philosophy had by this time outlived dialectical philosophy's usefulness. Dialectical philosophy now existed solely as a, quote, vestigial remnant, end quote. That, like the appendix, was not only useless, but also, quote, liable to dangerous infections, end quote. What was needed, therefore, was an intellectual appendectomy and a correct understanding of Marxism, which is not primarily a body of abstract theory, but, quote, the science and art of social revolution, end quote. Burnham further revealed the idiosyncratic bent of his Trotskyism in another brush with Max Eastman, who in March 1938 published a piece in Harper's citing Soviet life and the findings of modern science as reasons to question the compatibility of socialism and personal freedom and the validity of the socialist philosophy per se. Outraged at such effrontery, Trotsky wanted to see Eastman, quote, mercilessly, end quote, refuted, and turned to Burnham to do the job, parenthesis, in hopes of yoking him more tightly to the movement, Burnham later speculated, in parenthesis. Burnham agreed, and accused Eastman of advancing an overly abstract, unhistorical, and therefore meaningless idea of freedom, but hinted that the charge of abstractness could also be brought against his fellow Trotskyists, parenthesis, quote, I assume you noticed that my critique was in one respect rather against closer friends with Eastman, end quote, he remarked to Hooke, end parenthesis. In a second article, a reply to Eastman's counter-rebuttal, he remarked to Hooke, In a second article, a reply to Eastman's counter-rebuttal, he stuck to his maverick course, claiming that he could never make a final political commitment. Quote, I am for my part always ready to examine my program, end quote, he wrote, and, quote, and to accept it if I find it better than the one I had. And to accept it if I find it better than the one I hold, end quote. Burnham was also bothered by what he called, quote, the general problem of Bolshevism, end quote. Quote, if it is the case that without the revolution civilization perishes and that only under the leadership of the Bolsheviks can the revolution succeed, but that the present ideology and practice of Bolshevism carries the seeds of totalitarianism, parenthesis, all three of which premises seem most plausible, end parenthesis, then what to do for a longer-term perspective than month by month, he mused in 1938. Later that year, commenting on a draft article of Hooke's, he confessed himself, quote, much troubled in my reflections on the nature of democracy and its relations to Russia, to socialism, and to what is worthwhile in general, end quote. The usual democratic claim was that, quote, government shouldn't represent the will of the majority. The usual democratic claim was that, quote, government should, quote, represent the will of the majority, end quote. But, for example, the majority of what? Of the nation as it just happens to be now? Or some subdivision of it? Down to what? A town, a ward, a block, end quote. What should be done if socialism were established in the United States? Quote, but Iowa, Kentucky, and Queens didn't want it. or suppose with U.S. socialism a socialist revolution having in the first instance minority support began in Canada, what would your orders to the U.S. Red be your orders to the U.S. Red Army? End quote. But if Burnham's commitment to Trotskyism was cooling, he gave no sign of it in his day-to-day activity. In January 1939, Burnham again showed his dedication in a long New International article. Burnham wrote with Shachtman, but of which he was probably the principal author, called, quote, Intellectuals in Retreat, end quote. The article denounced Hooke, Eastman, and other former radicals for pulling back from the revolutionary cause and demanding a, quote, intellectual freedom, end quote, that was really freedom from, quote, responsibility, end quote. The, quote, philosophical discussion, end quote, the defectors claimed to want was really only, quote, a smokescreen, end quote, to hide their real goal, the article warned. For behind their left-sounding, quote, formal, avowed or alleged program, quote, lurked a, quote, actual, politically decisive program, end quote, that could be inferred from the strands they took on specific issues, a program of reformist liberalism. Yet reformism, however well conceived, would fail, the authors declared, striking the hard-boiled pose Trotskyists loved to affect. For politics was not a, quote, polite parlor game, end quote, but, quote, the struggle for power, and a very brutal struggle, end quote, to boot. The world could be saved only by revolution. Intellectuals in Retreat triggered a strong response. Burnham was becoming, quote, unspeakable, sick, and self-righteous, end quote, acting as if he were, quote, giving out certificates to people certifying that they, were, and or, were not, and Marxists and revolutionaries, end quote. Rov complained to Farrell. Hooke, the major villain of the article, was furious. Quote, Sidney and Jim Burnham had a run in here, at Farrell's apartment, end quote. Farrell wrote in his diary, quote, and I believe there is something brewing there which must have burst in personal acrimonies, end quote. The critic William Troy saw the article as the last example of a pattern he thought visible in Burnham's life. Burnham, quote, inclines to be strongly influenced in an intellectual sense by people and then to turn from them drastically, end quote. He commented to Farrell, quote, at Oxford, it was Father Darcy, then Wheelwright, then Hooke, end quote. But for the Trotskyists, especially the Socialist Workers' Party's younger members, the article is a resounding affirmation of the revolutionary faith, and no-holds-barred condemnation of the apostates had the galvanizing impact of a fiery revivalist sermon. Decades later, elderly Socialist Workers' Party alumni still vividly remembered how it had braced them. Did Burnham, however, unconsciously write, quote, the article, Intellectuals in Retreat, to bolster his own revolutionary faith? Was Burnham beginning to feel doubts and seeking to exercise those doubts? There is no way of telling, but given his differences with Trotsky and his tendency to agree with the very Sidney Hooke the article attacked, this may quite possibly have been the case. New section. Within the Socialist Workers' Party, Burnham continued to clash with Cannon. Just before the party's 1939 National Convention, he put a resolution before the Polcom aimed at moderating Cannon's dictatorial brand of leadership. Cannon partied the thrust. What do you say? Is that partied or parried? I don't know. I think that might be parried. Cannon parried the thrust. Cannon parried the thrust. But he was mettled by Burnham's attempt to curb his power. In contrast, Burnham remained on excellent terms with Trotsky and continued to furnish the old man with help and advice, knowing that Trotsky needed money, Burnham worked out a deal in 1939 with his Princeton classmate, Noel Bush, now a senior editor at Life magazine, under which Trotsky would sell the magazine a character sketch of Stalin and a piece on Lenin's death, illustrated with photographs of the author by the news photographer Margaret Bourke White. The articles were never written. That same year, Burnham had a hand in dissuading Trotsky from appearing before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which was planning legislation to outlaw the Communist Party. Trotsky had been eager to testify in order to publicize Stalin's terror. Yet between Burnham and Trotsky, a chasm was about to open. On the 23rd of August 1939, Germany and the USSR signed a non-aggression pact that included secret protocols providing for the partition between them of Poland and the tiny Baltic states. For the Socialist Workers' Party, the Russian question was back with a vengeance, and not as a theoretical problem, as in 1937, but as a practical issue, immediate and pressing. It was Burnham who first resurrected the Russian question, launching what Cannon would call, quote, the most voluminous party discussion in the history of mankind, end quote. Cannon. On the 3rd of September, 2 days after the Germans invaded Poland, and the day France and Britain declared war on Germany, Burnham asked for an emergency meeting of the National Committee, the Socialist Workers' Party's highest authority, short of a national convention, to review the party's position on the USSR. A meeting was scheduled for the end of the month. 2 days later, he contended at a Polcom meeting that the USSR, which he denied could be called a workers' state, quote, in any sense whatever, end quote, would soon attack Poland, not to defend the collectivized Soviet economy, but for purely, quote, imperialist, end quote, reasons. The Socialist Workers' Party commitment to, quote, unconditional defense of the USSR, he went on, should therefore be scrapped. Parenthesis, as for Poland, quote, the endless crimes of the Polish landlords, industrialist politicians, and generals against democracy, end quote, made that country also unworthy of Socialist Workers' Party support. On September 18th, the day after Soviet forces crossed the Polish frontier, he moved that the Polcom condemned the USSR for waging, quote, a war of imperialist conquest, end quote. Opposed by Cannon, the motion was defeated, but Shachtman came over to Burnham, and at the September 30th National Committee meeting made a motion of his own upholding the anti-Soviet view. Once again, Cannon prevailed, but this time by a mere 3 votes. Now Trotsky himself waded into the fray. In a new international article titled The USSR in War, which is on this channel, Trotsky leveled his usual charges at Stalin, but reaffirmed unconditional defense of the USSR on the ground that Soviet socialism had to be preserved. The same principle, he went on, justified the Soviet invasion of Poland. For the USSR, however, base its motives, would abolish private property in Poland, thereby advancing in the world interests of socialism. Moreover, he added in a follow-up article a month later, because the term, quote, imperialism denoted the, quote, expansionist policy of finance capitalism, end quote, the USSR by definition could not be imperialist. But Burnham and Shachtman would not yield to semantic obfuscation. The war was a contest between, quote, rival imperialisms for a new division of the world, end quote, they retorted. The sole issue was, quote, who was going to get the major share of the swag, end quote. By late 1939, Cannon's anxiety about the Burnham-Shachtman group, now probably a majority in the Socialist Workers' Party New York branch, had become acute. In a letter to a fellow Trotsky loyalist, Joseph Hansen, he diagnosed the source of the trouble as, quote, the unfavorable social composition, end quote, of the New York branch, where real workers were outnumbered by, quote, petty bourgeois intellectuals, end quote. When Burnham asked that the dissidents be guaranteed access to the party press, Cannon, backed by a Polcom majority, refused. Burnham wanted the Socialist Workers' Party to be, quote, a perpetual talking shop, end quote, Cannon huffed. But Cannon's victory prompted new complaints about a, quote, one-man party, end quote. Trotsky, hoping to head off a split and worried that the ham-handed Cannon might seek unity through, quote, organizational methods, end quote, i.e. the expulsion of the minority, called for, quote, discussion. Cannon, as always, did his master's bidding. The internal bulletin would henceforth have 2 editors, he decreed, one from each faction, and a commission consisting of 2 members of each faction would be set up to look into complaints. In addition, Burnham and Shachtman would still edit the New International, over which Shachtman had legal control anyway, but, as in the past, Cannon did not keep his word. Thus another dissident, Dwight MacDonald, who had, as he put it, quote, no trouble getting printed in Fortune, Harper's, The Nation, and The New Yorker, end quote, had a submission to the internal bulletin, quote, monotonously rejected, end quote. This would be his submissions to the international bulletin, quote, monotonously rejected, end quote. When Burnham continued to call for an equal voice in the party press, Cannon exploded. This, quote, demagogic demand for, quote, freedom of the press, end quote, represents a petty bourgeois anarchistic revolt against revolutionary centralism, end quote. Cannon stormed. The Soviet attack on Finland in November 1939 poured more fuel on the fire. For the Cannon faction, the attack marked a new advance by socialism, even if, as Trotsky put it, by, quote, bureaucratic methods, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party dissidents condemned the attack, but they were also hostile to, quote, bourgeois Finland, and put a resolution before the Polcom calling on both Soviet and Finnish workers to revolt. Burnham formally adhered to this, quote, third camp position, claiming that the workers alone were entitled to the support of socialists, but Burnham's true feelings may have been different. In mid-December, during a debate on Finland that Cannon described as, quote, hard and bitter, end quote, Burnham shed his usual detached manner, and in furious tones voiced the hope that the Red Army would be defeated. Years later, Burnham claimed that he had sided with Finland and Poland all along. Though this was not his public stance in 1939, the anger that possessed him during the December debates lends the claim credibility. A few days later, Burnham fired off a new polemic, the war and bureaucratic conservatism, which accused the Cannon faction of turning Stalinist, that is, putting the interests of the Socialist Workers' Party bureaucracy before all else. But he exempted Trotsky from this charge. Quote, Trotsky matches his organization to his policy, which he arrives at in principled fashion, end quote, he told Farrell, in parentheses. Then he fell into heresy, remarking that history's, quote, best-run revolution with the best collective leadership, end quote, was the American Revolution. Coming from a Trotskyist for whom the supreme revolution would have been the communist seizure of power in Russia in 1917, such a statement was appalling. Quote, in the organizational sense, end quote, Farrell concluded, Burnham was no Bolshevik. Trotsky did not reciprocate Burnham's generosity. In a scathing article called A Petty Bourgeois Opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party, which Burnham loyally ran in the New International, the old man sternly called the deviationist Burnham to order, arguing as he had in 1937 that the root of Burnham's errors lay in his failure to think dialectically. Stung by word that Burnham had reacted to this scolding with a shrug and a dismissive, quote, I stopped arguing about religion long ago, end quote, Trotsky raced back to his typewriter and loosed a second blast, quote, an open letter to Comrade Burnham, end quote, which charged that while Burnham, the intellectual leader of the opposition, might be highly educated, he showed no more understanding of politics than a, quote, witch doctor, end quote. Burnham's defects, Trotsky now joined Cannon, claiming, stemmed from Burnham's bourgeois background. The party wanted only those bourgeois who had cast away, quote, their social past and ... come over decisively to the standpoint of the proletariat, end quote. As the battle raged on, Trotsky grew increasingly bitter. Burnham was one of his prize catches, and he had worked hard to tie him tightly to the movement, but now the brilliant young man had gone too far. He had turned traitor, and with his scornful quip about dialectics, a condescending traitor at that. To Trotsky, Burnham was a rebellious son who had compounded injury with insult and refused to repent. In contrast to Trotsky, Burnham never lost his composure. He replied to Trotsky's tirades in an even tone that sometimes hinted at sadness. Trotsky's writing style could mesmerize Burnham. Burnham confessed in his reply to the old man's attacks, an essay called Science and Style. He had found the prose of Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, quote, wonderful, but now he realized that Trotsky saw, quote, persuasive rhetoric as logical demonstration, a brilliant metaphor as argument, end quote. In Trotsky's eyes, dialectical thinking was itself, quote, a device of style, end quote. Nor was this Trotsky's only flaw. By invoking the authority of Hegel, quote, that century-dead arch-muddler of human thought, end quote, in his defense of dialectics, while ignoring such modern works on logic as Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica and C.I. Lewis's Survey of Symbolic Logic, Trotsky also revealed that he was intellectually out of date. But the key problem is not whether dialectical logic was valid, but a practical matter, and a most urgent practical matter, quote, the strategic orientation of our movement during the first phase of the Second World War. The strategic orientation of our movement during the first phase of the Second World War, end quote. And on this issue, Trotsky's position amounted to a defense of Stalinism, quote, as the lesser evil, end quote. Burnham ended the piece by lamenting the conduct of the majority faction. Quote, a judge of political struggle morally as well as politically, end quote. Burnham wrote, quote, socialism is a moral ideal which reflective men choose deliberately by a moral act. Cold and sober scientific analysis convinces me that this ideal dictates an appropriate morality, which must govern the struggle for it. Just as we say that the white man cannot be free while the black is enslaved, so a social order based upon truth and freedom and loyal cooperation cannot be won by those who in their relations with each other base their methods of action on lies and disloyalty and slander, end quote. Burnham. Though Burnham does not seem to have realized that these words were his swan song as a Trotskyist. Science and Style enraged Trotsky supporters. The truth, snapped Cannon's friend Joseph Hansen, was that Burnham did not have a scientific view at all, quote, but just the brain sickness of a petty bourgeois moralist, end quote. An indignant reader in Kansas protested, quote, there is only one adjective I know that completely describes Science and Style, ... nasty. While reading and reflecting upon Science and Style, a picture persisted upon intruding, a picture of a decayed aristocrat, groomed to perfection in purple and fine linen, perfumed and lolling on silken cushions, and expounding in the exquisite finished diction of classical erudition his contempt for, his cruel hatred of the, quote, rabble, end quote, end quote. Cannon agreed, writing to Trotsky that, quote, in impudence and disdain and class hatred of the bracket socialist workers' parties and bracket proletarian majority, quote, end quote, the article exceeded all Burnham's previous factional writings. Trotsky issued a cooler condemnation, dismissing Burnham's views, parenthesis, as Burnham had just dismissed his, end parenthesis, as intellectually outmoded. Quote, Burnhamism, he commented, was, quote, only a belated reproduction of pre-Marxian petty bourgeois socialism, end quote. Trotsky. All the while, the rift in the party continued to deepen, and by early 1940, the Socialist Workers' Party leader had decided to hold an emergency national convention to resolve it. But several weeks before the convention, Cannon went to Burnham and Shachtman with an alternative solution, that they carry out a, quote, cold split, end quote. i.e., a peaceful breakup of the party with a proportional division of party property between the factions. The dissident leaders refused. Cannon, Shachtman speculated, hoped to bolster his power as leader of the Socialist Workers' Party by getting rid of the rebels. While reviling the entire opposition faction as, quote, liberal Philistines, quote, renegades, quote, stinkers, and, quote, traitors, out to ruin, quote, the only revolutionary movement in the whole world, end quote. Cannon saved his choicest abuse for Burnham, to his mind a social and intellectual snob who not only had the temerity to criticize Trotsky, but also refused to work for the party full time. It was Burnham's, quote, conscious design, Cannon charged in a letter to the party membership, to, quote, bring about the maximum possible disruption of our movement before taking his formal departure, end quote. Burnham, meanwhile, growing weary of the struggle, began to withdraw from it. He attended a national meeting of the opposition in Cleveland in February 1940, but played no so inconspicuous a role that another participant, Albert Glotzer, later wondered whether he had really been there. Parenthesis, it may be significant that he registered in Cleveland as, quote, James Burnham, end quote, a name much closer to his own than his party alias, quote, Kelvin, in parentheses. Nor was he now much in evidence in New York. Shachtman found Burnham, quote, very badly disenchanted, end quote, by Trotsky's behavior, especially the old man's blind support of Cannon, and on top of his disillusionment with Trotsky, Burnham now seemed uncertain about the value of the movement and even of socialism. After confiding his doubts to Shachtman and going through the pros and cons of staying in the movement, he would decide to stay, only to take up the issue all over again a few days later. Quote, it was a running effort on my part, and I suppose to a certain extent on his part, to keep him in, end quote, Shachtman recalled. After 7 months of increasingly furious debate, the factional struggle finally reached its climax. At the Socialist Workers' Party Emergency National Convention, held in New York in April 1940, the Cannon wing carried the day, passing by a vote of 55 to 34 resolutions endorsing Trotsky's dicta on the USSR and its role in the war, and refusing the minority's demand for a newspaper of its own. A week later, the National Committee banned oppositionists from holding party posts until they had accepted the majority position. In practice, this meant the expulsion of Burnham, Shachtman, and others who would not recant. Cannon showed no graciousness in victory. The Socialist Workers' Party could not be led by, quote, dilettantes, bracket, sick, in bracket, I think dilettantes is misspelled there, whose real interest and real lives are in another world, end quote, Cannon later wrote. Otherwise put, those who preferred Sutton Place dinner parties to Socialist Workers' Party socials and their own opinions to Cannon's need not apply. In the months following the split, Trotsky repeatedly voiced his disappointment with Burnham, the, quote, educated witch doctor, end quote, strutting petty bourgeois pedant, end quote, intellectual snob, end quote. But he also paid a kind of tribute to the black sheep's talents. Burnham, quote, can write, end quote, Trotsky admitted, quote, and has some formal skill in thinking, not deep but adroit. He can accept your idea, develop your idea, write a fine article about it, and then forget it, ... However, so long as we can use such people, well and good. Mussolini at one time was also, quote, good stuff, end quote, Trotsky. Burnham did not reply, but dumped his correspondence with Trotsky into his apartment incinerator. In the future, he could speak of the old man critically. In the future, he would speak of the old man critically, but never vituperatively. Indeed, years later, his emotional wounds having long since healed, he gave the writer Charles Lamb Markman the impression that he still viewed his first political mentor with great respect. New section. With the Socialist Workers' Party irrevocably fractured, the expelled minority at once set about forming a new party, the Workers' Party, to preserve a pure Bolshevism purged of Trotsky's errors. At first, Burnham took part in this effort. He spoke at the new party's inaugural public meeting, quote, and spoke very well, end quote. Shachtman remembered and was slated to report to the founding convention on the party constitution. But on the eve of the convention, he suddenly resigned from the WPA review of his beliefs. But on the eve of the convention, Burnham suddenly resigned from the Workers' Party. A review of his beliefs, Burnham explained in his letter of resignation, had convinced him that he could no longer accept Marxism, whose ideas modern historians, economists, and anthropologists have shown to be false. Nor could Burnham accept the Leninist idea of a party, which seemed to him, quote, incompatible with genuine scientific method and genuine democracy, end quote. Burnham should have left the movement earlier, Burnham confessed, but had held back out of, quote, a sense of moral obligation, end quote, to people with whom he had worked and whose thinking he had influenced. Burnham still admired socialism as a moral ideal and thought it would be, quote, a good thing, end quote, if socialism were achieved. But Burnham did not think it would be achieved, for mounting evidence had persuaded Burnham that what history now held in store was, quote, a new form of exploitive society, end quote, which he called, quote, managerial society, end quote. Burnham's abrupt resignation stunned party members, though perhaps not Shachtman. Quote, the news came like a blow to the head, end quote, recalled one Workers' Party member, Irving Pankin. The same common response, said another, Albert Glotzer, was not anger but disappointment and sadness. Some comrades, however, did react angrily, not because Burnham had changed his politics, said member Irving Howe, but because Burnham had, quote, led them into the split and then left them in the lurch, end quote, never so much as hinting that he had lost his faith in Marxism. Quote, it was like the feeling you get from a bad divorce, end quote, Howe noted half a century later. According to Sidney Hook, Dwight MacDonald, who idolized Burnham, felt betrayed. Perhaps uneasy about the suddenness of his exit, Burnham tried to soften its impact. To minimize embarrassment to the Workers' Party, Burnham would keep his resignation secret for as long as the party wanted, he told Shachtman. In addition, he was willing to write a column for the newspaper the Workers' Party was planning. Shachtman, who knew when the game was over, did not take him up on these offers. Burnham was also ready to help in another way. Soon after his departure, Glotzer, lacking the money to print an issue of the New International, appealed to the paper's former co-editors for assistance. In reply, Burnham sent him $20. It was his last service to the movement. In a letter of 1976 to the British political analyst Brian Crozier, Burnham furnished his own explanation of how he had come to embrace and then reject Trotskyism, claiming never to have swallowed, quote, dialectical materialism, or more generally, the ideological side of Marxism, end quote. Burnham described his participation in the movement as basically, quote, pragmatic, resting on a simple syllogism, end quote. Convinced by the Depression and Hitler's coming to power that capitalism was collapsing and no longer capable of sustaining a, quote, acceptable society, quote, I assumed, that socialism was the only alternative, and perhaps partly by accident, I tied up with the Trotskyists with the notion that a, quote, new revolutionary party, end quote, was the way to achieve socialism, end quote. Burnham. But as time passed, Burnham had come to see that the USSR, quote, was neither a worker state nor a capitalist state, end quote, and that all forms of revolutionary Marxism had to turn totalitarian. And so he said goodbye to Trotskyism, leaving the movement so coolly as he had joined it, quote, I never had the sort of, quote, commitment to Bolshevism, usual among those who have active leading roles in a Bolshevik organization, end quote. He told Fraser, quote, more exactly, my commitment was rational and pragmatic, not spiritual. That is why I did not go through the usual emotional and spiritual turmoil that, in most cases, marks the break with Bolshevism. God had not failed so far as I was concerned. I had been mistaken, and when I came to realize the extent of my mistakes, it was time to say goodbye, end quote. Burnham. As this letter implies, Burnham liked to picture himself as able to rise above emotion, view the world with analytical detachment, draw rational conclusions from his observations, and then take appropriate action. Quote, cold and sober scientific analysis, end quote, had led Burnham to join the movement, Burnham explained, and when experience proved that Burnham had made a mistake, Burnham had left. But there are reasons, for example, Burnham's stunned reaction to industrial violence in the Midwest in 1933, and his agonizing with Shachtman in 1940, to question his account, to think that his embrace of socialism had originated at least as much in emotional upset as in dispassionate analysis, and that his departure from the movement was less the result of cool deliberation than an abrupt climax to months of nervous strain. Quote, midway, this way of life were bound upon, I awoke to find myself in a dark wood, where the right word was wholly lost and gone, end quote. Begins Dante's Inferno, the first part of what Burnham once called, quote, the most wonderful poem ever written, end quote. Teaching the Inferno regularly at NYU, Burnham knew it well. When Burnham woke to find himself in his own dark wood, Trotskyism, did Dante's words ever cross his mind? New section. It is tempting to write off Burnham's Trotskyist phase as wasted time, a 6-year detour into the sterile world of left-wing sex. But this judgment would be wrong. True, James Burnham's Trotskyist writings, purveying a conventional Marxist-Leninist view of the world, do not show his intellectual powers to best advantage. Also true, Burnham spent much of his time in the movement caught up in barren factional squabbling, but in important ways the involvement prepared him for what would be his real career. It was because of Trotskyism that he shifted his focus from literature to politics, began to read and ponder political theory, discovered his flair for political analysis and commentary, and became engrossed in the USSR and communism. Trotskyism, in short, was Burnham's school of politics. At first glance, the Bolshevik James Burnham, who edited the New International, might seem poles apart from the conservative James Burnham who edited National Review. Yet in reality, they were much alike. No one was more aware of Burnham's debt to Trotsky than Burnham himself. Many former leftists, quote, were taught our first lessons by Trotsky, end quote. He wrote several years after his break with the movement. Quote, this primary instruction has influenced not only our subsequently reached options, but more enduringly the categories and presuppositions through which we try to understand political events, end quote. He had learned, for example, that economics exercises a powerful sway over politics. This idea helped to shape his book, The Managerial Revolution, published in 1941 when his outlook was still heavily influenced by Marxism. Published in 1941 when his outlook was still heavily influenced by Marxism, And although it would eventually figure much less prominently in Burnham's thinking, it still continued to surface from time to time. Thus, in the draft of an article probably written in the 1960s, Burnham asserted, quote, when there is not enough to go around, one part of the population will take all it needs and wants and enforce social and political arrangements to make sure the others can't horn in, end quote. And again, quote, when used broadly, end quote, Marxist analysis was valid, he told the historian John P. Diggins in 1971. 5 years later, he wrote to Brian Crozier, quote, I still think there are elements of truth in the Leninist theory of the state, in some aspects of the economics and some insights of the economic theory of history, end quote. Burnham. Trotskyism, Burnham believed, had also immunized him against ideology as such, quote, having come to know something of the gigantic ideology of Bolshevism, end quote. Burnham wrote a generation after the movement, quote, I knew that I was not going to be able to settle for the pygmy ideologies of liberalism, social democracy, refurbished laissez-faire, or the inverted cut-rate Bolshevism called, quote, fascism, end quote, Burnham. Burnham thought Trotskyism had marked him in another way as well, quote, in spite of my present rejection of communism, end quote, he told the French writer André Malraux, quote, another 30s leftist who moved to the right, end in 1947, quote, I nevertheless felt that the experience of communism, The experience of communism may have been a necessary phase in the moral development of our generation. Two men today who seem outwardly to agree completely in their views will continue to sense an age between them if one has and one has not lived through communism. End quote. Burnham. Burnham did not seem to find his Trotskyist past embarrassing. In later times, Burnham sometimes alluded to his movement years, and always in a matter-of-fact tone, yet on one occasion, Burnham's usual aplomb deserted him. In the late 1960s, when a young National Review staffer with whom he was chatting happened to mention his distant Trotskyist period, then the reply he could muster was a blush. All right, that's the end of that chapter. I might read the next chapter of this book, the Prophet, just because that's probably about the managerial revolution, but that's probably the last chapter I read from this book. Thanks for listening.